So we kind of touched on this before. We were talking about like how do we start that conversation? I think you said gently. But should we have like maybe some like basic examples or some like simple ones you can think of about like what are some reasonable boundaries we can ask of like our partners and friends and other relationships to help us feel maybe more secure, seen, or heard?
So are we talking about them in a framework of like you're newly starting to navigate polyamory, or just in general relationally, or what are we talking about here?
I mean, I think probably both. If we can do both, can we do both?
Let's do both. Both is good.
Sure.
Both is good.
I mean, yeah, once again, I feel like that's pretty subjective, but well, I guess I can look on my personal boundaries. Safer sex practices. Kind of getting on the same page with that, I feel like is a good beginning conversation to have, whether you're in a polyamorous relationship or monogamous, or you're a swinger or whatever. I feel like that's like a good conversation to start in on when it comes to navigating these things.
Mm, definitely. Yeah, I mean, especially I definitely see with like safer sex too. I hear before multiple times people have been like almost taken aback or offended by the idea that I might want like some blood work or like an STI panel done before engaging with each other. And I think it's scary to know that if I didn't bring that up, that maybe that would have been something that was just swept under the carpet and not even addressed. Yeah, so so kind of building off of that, are there like um what things are good like maybe safer sex practices to put boundaries around? Like, is it okay to ask your partner not to have like maybe interact with sex workers or going to strip clubs? Or if it is okay to ask them not to do that, is there like a right and wrong way to go about that?
Um, just because of me and who I am as a person, super soft therapist. I definitely wouldn't want to say it's not okay or it's okay. I think they're curious things to talk about. Like, if my partner came to me and they were like, I don't want you going to strip clubs, I would want to know like what's going on behind there. Like, if you can kind of let me into your world and I can understand, maybe I'll agree. But off the top of it, like someone being like, no, don't go to strip clubs, I'm like, well, that's not an okay thing to ask. Like, I think it just all has to do with like whether it makes it okay or not okay is like, where are you coming from when you're asking me these things? I think it all goes back to that.
Yeah, and I think also like it's important to like when you have that first conversation, which is going to be awkward and uncomfortable, and you're not going to get everything on the table. It's because there's so many things that could possibly happen. There's no way you can pre-talk about everything. Is that the conversation has to continue, right? It's like, well, okay, it's like we set this boundary, then you went out this weekend. You were, we respected the boundaries, but let's talk about it. Let's talk about how it felt for you, how it felt for me. Do we change the boundary? Do we agree that this boundary was too restrictive and that we should be a little bit, or the exact opposite? Okay, this happened and it turned out I'm not as okay with this as I thought I was. Can we talk about this? But I think you made it a good point that when you say you don't go to strip clubs, usually there's something, like for me personally, there's something there behind. It's not the strip club and it's not the going to the strip clubs. It's something behind that, like maybe a bad experience or something you associate with going to strip clubs that you don't like maybe it's because a ridiculous amount of money has the potential of being spent there, right? So let's talk about that. It's not seeing another naked body, it's that you're dumping a lot of cash into it. Then when you keep on talking about it and try to find the deeper issues, maybe that's something that does turn into a more healthy boundary to set.
Mm-hmm. I love that you kind of touched on that, like, just because something gets agreed upon, it doesn't mean like the conversation stops there. It should be continuous and ever evolving. And I think a lot of people get scared, like, okay, well, this is what we decided. It is never going to change. We're going to carve that in stone. Like, it's like, no, no, no. Like, what maybe worked for you a couple of years ago or worked for y'all doesn't work anymore. That conversation needs to continue to happen and there to be flexibility and, um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that totally makes sense. So kind of in that vein, like, are there any like practices that you engage in, or maybe like standard practices you might recommend for like other like polyamorous couples, or not couples, I guess, obviously, groups, partners, um, that they can, that can help them to like keep that conversation going and renegotiating contracts further if like those feelings do change.
Oh yeah, man. I get real nerdy. Like I'm a therapist by trade, but like this is just like how I am in general. With my partners, we do a relationship check-in every week.
Love that.
So, and that looks the check-in looks different based off of that partner and I, but like what it looks like with my anchor partner is, we talk about readiness to date other people. We talk about what's going good in our relationship this week, what's going bad, appreciations that we have for each other, stuff like that. I do that. I do that every week with each of my partners because I'm a nerd.
I love the intentionality of that. I think maybe a lot of us probably engage in that sort of thing kind of offhandedly or passively, but I think that's probably how it ends up getting forgotten about or done less frequently. I think the intentionality of that like weekly revisit and check in, and that sounds so awesome. um, so are there any like kind of like red flags that maybe you notice that like when you're negotiating that maybe something you're asking for is not okay, or maybe is like breaching those boundaries, or yeah.
Hmm. Something like red flags of things that I'm kind of wanting to negotiate that are maybe bordering on like this is a big ask, this is inappropriate.
Yeah, or that, yeah. Yep.
I can say for me, because I'm a deeply emotional person, as we all are, because we're all human beings. I find that if I have a strong emotional reaction to something that a partner has done or whatever, and I immediately choose that moment to be like, oh, we're having a conversation about this now, and I want to talk about boundaries, I want to talk about how we're going to conduct ourselves, that's usually not the best point to enter into that conversation. I'm too whipped up. I haven't had a chance to kind of like piece out what is happening for me. So usually if the conversation point and my strong reaction, if those two things happen too close together, I'm usually not going to get anywhere super productive. So I guess that's a personal red flag for me, that I might ask for something that is inappropriate, that is not something that I should be asking for.
That's really interesting, because I think maybe I was kind of anticipating more of like, um I, I don't know, I guess like maybe I'm realizing some of my own like internal things that I hold, like live in action of like trying to like read something from them, but learning to like, I think that's really interesting of like noticing your own emotional state and learning to take the step back and maybe attempt it again in a way that's a little bit more effective.
No, that makes
Um,
sense to me. Like I looked at that question, I was thinking about you'd say, okay, these are certain things that you're not allowed to ask for a boundary on or not allowed to ask for. And then you come in here with no, it's more about your mental state and the reasons that you're asking for it in the first place. I think that's awesome. And it makes sense because like when you're angry, that's not the best time to make a decision or to try to have a conversation. So yeah, it makes sense. Like this happened. And you can't help how you feel about it. If something made you jealous, if something made you upset, if something hurt you, that's a natural, valid feeling. But that doesn't mean that that time to talk about it is while you are still processing that emotion. It's like process it within yourself and then have that conversation. Like that's happened to me a couple of times, where something happened, I was caught off guard by how it would affect me, and then we'd have to talk about it and figure it out, and figure out what. And again, the instant thought might be, okay, you are no longer allowed to do this with another person because of this, how I felt inside. But that's just the initial reaction. Then when you have the time to think about it and talk about it, then you realize, oh, it's not so much the specific action perhaps, but more that, yeah, just pulling it off the top of my head, this is something that you seem to willingly engage in with somebody else, but not with me. And that kind of made me feel a little awkward. Can we talk about this and try to figure out what's going on? I don't know what the specifics might be, but yeah, don't talk about it while you're angry. Don't talk about it while you're sad. Don't talk about it while you're horny. Settle down and get into a rational frame of mind. And then, but put that pin there. Say, it's like, we're going to, I want to talk to you about this at some point. It's good.
And it's not like that's like a nice thing for me to be able to like sit here and say that, like, oh, that's what you should do. And it is something that I legitimately try to do, in my life. But like when it's happening and I'm like, we're having that strong emotional reaction, like it's not super easy to just like, oh, well, let me wait for a second, let me like engage intentionally with it. Like sometimes that happens and sometimes that doesn't. And all you can kind of I guess this is like, foundational boundary, I guess, if we want to talk about it, is you're allowed to have your emotions, but you're not allowed to let it disrespectfully, inappropriately inform your action or your behavior towards someone else. Like you're not allowed to lash out irrationally. That's where, you do need to take a pause and reflect and make sure that, you're not letting the heat of the moment inform how you treat someone.
Yeah, I do see we have a couple more callers we're going to get to in just a second, but I think that is a really maybe like almost the most, at least for me, I don't know about the viewers or anything, the most helpful thing is I think sometimes we encounter a lot of this advice of these like, kind of like ways of navigating relationships. And it's like, oh, when you encounter the situation, just do X, and kind of being able to remind yourself and forgive yourself when you're like, we are, you know, we're humans, we're animals, like we're not going to always handle things as effectively as we possibly could. I think that kind of mindset of reminding ourselves goes a long way, and maybe even helps to foster the good behaviors a little more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, grace for self is so important, especially, I mean, that's important in all kinds of relationship dynamics, but especially when you're going forward in something that is kind of new terrain, like polyamory or kink or whatever. I don't know how to do this. This is the first time that I'm doing this in this life. I got to have some grace for how I'm navigating that.
Definitely.